Jack had woken up that morning with a craving for fresh fish. He could already imagine the sizzle of butter in the pan, the crispy golden skin, and the satisfaction of catching his own dinner from the lake. But when he stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, his entire body froze. His boat was gone. Not misplaced, not tied up in the wrong spot, completely gone. The dock was empty, the rope dangling uselessly where it should have been secured. His stomach twisted. There was only one person in this town foolish enough to pull something like this. Karen. The name alone made Jack's jaw clench. She was the type of woman who believed the world revolved around her whims. Ever since she had bought that overpriced vacation home near the lake, she had been a constant thorn in everyone's side. She treated the town like her personal playground, taking whatever she wanted without asking, and talking down to anyone who dared to question her. Just last week, she had walked onto his property and taken a basket full of his fresh eggs, saying she assumed they were for everyone. The woman had no shame. But stealing his boat? That was a new level of audacity. Jack didn't have to be a detective to know where to start looking. He hopped on his ATV and followed the familiar dirt path toward Karen's lakefront property, his blood simmering hotter with each passing second. As he approached, he spotted it instantly. His boat, floating out on the water, with Karen and a group of her equally obnoxious friends lounging in it, laughing as they fished. She wasn't just using his boat. She was throwing a whole party on it. Jack stopped his ATV and took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. He walked down toward the shore, hands in his pockets, his boots crunching against the gravel. Karen spotted him and waved like he was an old friend visiting for tea. "Oh hey Jack. Great boat, by the way. Super comfy." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Karen, that's my boat." She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Well, technically, it's just a boat. Does ownership really matter when it's just sitting there?" Jack clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "It was sitting there because it belongs to me. You didn't ask. You just took it." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes as she reeled in her fishing line. "Oh, come on. It's not like you were using it right this second. Don't be selfish. Besides, you should be flattered. We're giving it some use instead of letting it rot on your dock." One of her friends, a man with sunglasses and a smirk that made Jack want to throw him into the lake, raised his beer in a mock toast. "Yeah man, chill out. It's just a boat." Jack took a deep breath, his patience wearing thinner by the second. "Karen, I want my boat back. Now." Karen sighed dramatically, as if he was asking for the impossible. "Ugh, fine. But we're in the middle of fishing. I'll bring it back later." Jack's jaw twitched. "You'll bring it back now." Karen turned away dismissively. "Oh, relax, Jack. We'll be done in a few hours. I promise." Jack knew better than to believe a word out of her mouth. He stood there, fists clenched, watching as they continued fishing like he wasn't even there. A slow, calculated rage burned inside him. He could take her to the authorities, but he knew Karen would just weasel her way out of it with excuses. He could yell, make a scene, but that wouldn't change her entitled attitude. No, if he really wanted to teach Karen a lesson, he had to be smarter than that. As he turned and walked back toward his ATV, an idea began to form in his mind. A wickedly brilliant idea. If Karen thought she could take what wasn't hers, then maybe it was time she experienced the consequences of her actions firsthand. A slow grin crept onto Jack's face as the plan took shape. That night, long after Karen and her freeloading friends had finally returned his boat, Jack got to work. He pulled the boat up onto shore, grabbed his toolbox, and began making some very special modifications. Tiny, carefully placed holes, just enough to let water seep in slowly, unnoticed at first, until it was too late. He patched them up with a bit of paint, just enough to hide them from someone who wasn't paying attention. Karen never checked anything that wasn't handed to her on a silver platter. She wouldn't notice a thing until it was far too late. Jack stood back and admired his handiwork. The boat looked just as it always had. perfectly normal, perfectly innocent, and perfectly ready for round two. Now all he had to do was wait. And as he expected, it didn't take long. The very next morning, he overheard Karen bragging to a neighbor about how easy it was to borrow things from Jack's property. "He just leaves his stuff out in the open like an idiot," she laughed. "I swear, it's like he wants me to use it." Jack smirked. Hook, line, and sinker. That afternoon, he made sure to be seen chatting with a few locals, casually mentioning how he was going out of town for a few days and had left his boat right there on the dock. It was all too easy. By the time he returned home, the boat was gone again. And this time, he was more than ready for the show. Jack grabbed a pair of binoculars and made himself comfortable on his porch, sipping his coffee as he watched the lake. Sure enough, there was Karen, laughing it up with her friends, completely oblivious to the slow trickle of water creeping up around their feet. He could already imagine the moment they'd realize what was happening, the panic, the scrambling, the sheer, perfect chaos. Jack leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. It was going to be a very interesting afternoon. Jack sat on his porch, hands folded behind his head, watching the lake with a satisfied smirk. The morning sun shimmered on the water, and the birds chirped their usual melodies, completely unaware of the unfolding chaos that was about to take place. He had spent years trying to reason with people like Karen, but he had come to learn that some lessons in life had to be experienced, not explained. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his binoculars resting beside him, ready for the show. He had been careful, meticulous even, in ensuring that Karen wouldn't notice anything wrong when she inevitably stole his boat again. The holes were small, placed just right so the boat wouldn't sink immediately, but rather take on water slowly. Too slowly to be detected in the first few minutes, but fast enough to turn a carefree fishing trip into an absolute disaster. Karen had fallen right into his trap, just as he knew she would. She and her friends had taken the boat out again that afternoon, laughing and clinking their overpriced drinks together like they were royalty. He could already hear her voice in his head, making snarky remarks about how easy it was to take advantage of the hillbilly who lived by the lake. She had no idea she was about to have the most eventful fishing trip of her life. Jack watched as Karen and her group cast their fishing lines, still blissfully unaware of what was happening beneath them. The boat bobbed gently on the water, everything seemingly normal. One of the guys, the one who had been drinking since they left the dock, propped his feet up lazily and leaned back with a smug grin. Karen, meanwhile, was more focused on her phone than anything else, probably snapping selfies to show off her relaxing afternoon on her borrowed boat. Then it began. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in the boat's balance, a soft creaking sound as the wood absorbed more water. The difference was barely noticeable, just enough to make one of Karen's friends glance down at the floorboards with mild confusion. She squinted, rubbing her eyes like she wasn't sure if she was seeing things correctly. The guy with the beer chuckled, oblivious, and took another long sip. Then, as if nature itself decided to speed things along, Karen shifted in her seat, and a small pool of water swirled around her feet. She yelped, jerking up so fast that her sunglasses nearly flew off her face. "What the hell?" she shrieked, lifting her designer sandals as if the water was about to bite her. Her friend, the one who had first noticed it, leaned forward with furrowed brows. Guys? Why is there water coming in?" Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, calm down. It's just a little water. Probably splashed in when we got in." Jack smirked as he watched the moment unfold. Oh, if only she knew. A few more minutes passed, and that little water turned into a noticeable puddle. The boat tilted slightly, enough to make one of the men clutch the side for balance. Karen's smug confidence started to waver. She reached down hesitantly and pressed her palm against the wet floor, her fingers coming away soaked. "Okay, this is not normal," she muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Is there a leak or something?" The guy with the beer finally took his feet down and peered over the side of the boat. "I don't see anything," he said, then frowned. Wait, is the boat sitting lower than before? Karen's eyes widened as realization hit. She stood up too fast, causing the boat to rock violently. Water sloshed up the sides, making her friends yelp in panic. The guy with the beer lost his grip on his drink, watching helplessly as it rolled into the deep blue below. Jack let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. It was almost too perfect. Karen scrambled toward the back of the boat, her earlier confidence gone. Where's the damn motor? We need to get back now. One of the women frantically grabbed at the controls, twisting the ignition. The motor sputtered, coughed, and then silence. Dead. Karen's scream of frustration echoed across the lake. She grabbed the radio, pressing buttons aggressively. Hello? Hello? Somebody come get us. The static-filled silence was her only response. Karen's face drained of color as the reality of the situation sank in. The boat wasn't just leaking. It was actively sinking. Her friends scrambled, some grabbing whatever floating objects they could find, while others simply panicked in place. Karen turned in circles, her arms flailing as she tried to come up with a solution. But there was none. The water was rising faster now, seeping in through the tiny holes at an alarming rate. One of the women shrieked, "Oh my God, I see a fish! It's swimming inside the boat!" That sent everyone into a new wave of hysteria. Karen grabbed one of the paddles and started splashing wildly, as if that would do anything to stop the inevitable. Another man started bailing out water with an empty cooler, a feeble attempt that did nothing except spread the panic further. By this point, Jack wasn't even trying to hide his laughter. He leaned back in his chair, shaking with amusement as he watched Karen's entire world crumble around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of chaos, another boat approached from the other side of the lake. It was one of the local fishermen, Hank, who had heard the commotion and came to investigate. He slowed his boat as he took in the sight before him. Karen, drenched in lake water, screaming into a broken radio while her friends clung to the sinking remains of Jack's boat. Hank let out a long whistle. Well, well, well. What do we have here? Karen's head snapped up and she waved frantically. Help us! This stupid boat is sinking. Hank raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean Jack's boat? The one you borrowed? Karen stiffened. That's not important right now. Just get us out of here. Hank snorted but maneuvered his boat closer, tossing a rope to them. One by one, they scrambled onto his deck, looking like a pack of wet, miserable puppies. Karen was the last one to climb aboard, muttering curses under her breath. As they pulled away, she turned one last time to watch Jack's boat, her stolen afternoon of fun, disappear beneath the surface. Jack set down his binoculars with a grin, stretching his arms behind his head. He could already picture the next part, the inevitable confrontation, the excuses, the shifting blame. But none of it would change the reality of what had happened. Karen had stolen from the wrong person, and she had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that some things just weren't hers to take. The news spread across the lake community faster than wildfire. By the time Karen and her miserable, waterlogged friends were brought back to shore, nearly everyone had heard about the great sinking of Jack's boat. The locals gathered along the docks, some pretending to mind their business while others didn't even bother to hide their amusement. They had seen Karen pull stunts before, but this was something else entirely. She had been caught red-handed, humiliated, and brought back dripping wet like a stray cat tossed into a bathtub. Jack strolled down toward the commotion, taking his time as he watched the scene unfold. Karen was standing there, arms crossed, shivering slightly, her designer sunglasses now perched crookedly on her head. Her friends were still shaking water out of their clothes, muttering under their breath about how the whole trip had turned into a disaster. The guy who had lost his beer earlier was particularly bitter, looking down at his soggy shoes with a defeated sigh. Hank, the fisherman who had rescued them, stepped off his boat and let out a low chuckle. Well, that was one for the books, he said, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see a boat stolen and sunk in the same day. Karen whipped her head toward him, her face twisted with frustration. It wasn't my fault. That boat was defective. It was sinking before we even noticed. Jack finally decided to make his presence known, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate stride. He let out a thoughtful hum. Defective, huh? He mused, rubbing his chin. That's funny. It was working just fine before it mysteriously disappeared off my dock. You wouldn't happen to know how that happened, would you, Karen? Karen's jaw clenched as she turned to face him, her usual arrogance flickering behind the embarrassment on her face. Oh, don't play innocent, Jack. You knew I was going to use the boat. Why would you leave it out if you didn't want me to borrow it? Jack raised an eyebrow. Borrow? That's an interesting word choice. Most people call it stealing when you take something without permission. Karen scoffed. Oh, come on. It was just a boat. You weren't even using it. It's not like I was going to keep it forever. Jack let out a low chuckle. Well, you sure weren't going to return it in the same condition, either. A few of the locals let out quiet laughs, and Karen's face turned a shade of red that could rival the sunset over the lake. She turned sharply toward Hank. You saw it. The boat was taking on water. That's not my fault. Hank smirked, arms crossed over his chest. Oh, I saw plenty. I saw a bunch of folks having a grand old time on a boat they had no business being on. And then I saw that same bunch freaking out when they realized they weren't as clever as they thought they were. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration mounting. This is ridiculous. I could have drowned out there. Jack tilted his head, feigning concern. That does sound awful. But then again, maybe next time you should ask before taking something that isn't yours. Karen's fists clenched at her sides, her frustration boiling over. You think you're so funny, don't you? She snapped. You set me up. Jack shrugged. I didn't tell you to steal my boat, Karen. You made that choice all on your own. Karen opened her mouth, no doubt ready to launch into another round of excuses, but before she could speak, another voice cut in from the crowd. This isn't the first time she's helped herself to other people's stuff. Heads turned toward the speaker, an older man named Bill, who owned one of the largest farms on the lake. He stepped forward, shaking his head. Last month, she was on my property picking apples like she owned the trees. When I confronted her, she said she was just sampling them. Another woman, Nancy, chimed in. She took my firewood. Said she thought it was community wood because it was stacked near the road. A chorus of agreement rippled through the crowd, voices overlapping with shared stories of Karen's entitled behavior. Jack leaned back slightly, watching as the tide shifted against her. She had spent so much time treating the town like her personal playground, assuming nobody would ever call her out. But now, standing there dripping wet and humiliated, she was facing something she wasn't used to, consequences. Karen turned in a slow circle, her expression flickering between anger and discomfort as she realized just how many people had grievances against her. She forced out a laugh, but it was weak, hollow. Oh, come on, you all can't seriously be mad over little things like that. The crowd's silence was answer enough. Jack crossed his arms. Sounds to me like people are tired of your borrowing. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for a way out of the situation. Finally, she scoffed and flipped her wet hair over her shoulder. Whatever. You people are so dramatic. It's just a stupid boat. Jack took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. Right. And if it's just a stupid boat, then you won't mind paying for it. Karen stiffened. What? Jack pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up. Since you seem so confused about how ownership works, let me make it real simple. That boat wasn't yours. You took it without permission. And now it's at the bottom of the lake. So, unless you want me to press charges for theft, you're going to reimburse me for the full cost of replacing it. Karen's eyes widened. You can't be serious. Jack didn't blink. Oh, I'm dead serious. But if you'd rather deal with the sheriff, I can call him up right now. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She glanced around, but nobody was coming to her defense. Even her own friends looked hesitant, unwilling to get dragged further into her mess. Finally, she let out a strangled sigh. Fine. How much? Jack unfolded the paper and listed the amount, a fair but solid price. Karen paled but didn't argue. She knew she had no way out of this one. With a mumbled promise to pay, she turned on her heel and stormed away, her soaked clothes clinging to her as she stomped back toward her house. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Jack exhaled in satisfaction. The boat was gone, but it had been a small price to pay for the lesson Karen had learned. More importantly, she wouldn't be setting foot near his property again anytime soon. Later that evening, as he sat by the lake with a cold drink in hand, he watched the water, peaceful and still. No stolen boat. No entitled trespassers. Just the quiet, uninterrupted calm of the lake. And for Jack, that was worth every bit of trouble it had taken to get there.